Morris had two very famous examples of how signification works, and he defined his ideas, or he presented his ideas, progressive ideas in signification through his examples. And the examples were two. The first one was an example of a dog and how the dog reacts, and how through this he contests behaviorist theories. And the second one was the example of the person driving from town A to town B, and there's a roadblock. The first one, the example of the dog, was concerned the reaction of the dog to a buzzing sound, a bzzz. So, you know, when you train a dog to get food, when there's a buzzing sound, the dog, you know, hears the buzzer and runs over to the plate or something, and, you know, after the buzzer sounds, and starts to anticipate the coming of food, or, you know, the food is there and everything. So the semiosis here is the action of the buzzer. So the buzzer sounds, and then the dog knows that there is food. And this buzzing sound provokes some sort of action of seeking food, or in Pavlov's dog, it acts on its glands, causing it to salivate. Okay. But, however, what happens before this? Because it's not, you know, it's not a case of the dog being born into this semiotic sequence. The dog isn't born knowing that it hears the buzzer and knowing that the food is going to come. Something must precede this. So the dog interprets the noise as a buzzer, and this simple perception, the simple perception of interpreting the noise as a buzzer, is already an interpretation in itself. So first the dog hears the noise, then interprets it as a buzzer, then the buzzer interpretation is the come and get food, or food is coming, or something, signification. So the sound then hits the ear in a certain way, and the dog knows that it is supposed to react in a certain way because of this buzzer. So the first action it provokes is an interpretation into that it is a buzzer, which identifies a particular sound, and then after that, this particular sound is interpreted into a need or anticipation of food in some way. So the first inference by the dog is that the noise is interpreted as a buzzer sound, or that certain sound, and the second is that, well, there's food and food is coming. Then there is a third inference, or a third interpretation, where the reaction that emanates from this consists of directing attention to seeking food. And this is the goal-seeking behavior. Okay, the second example, which is the second example from Morris, which is the example of the driver who's driving from town A to town B, wants to get from Paris to Dakar, which is quite far, or from Alexandria to Cairo, or from from Rome to Milan or something. The driver must accomplish a series of previous semioses. So you cannot just go from Rome to Pavia, which is a tiny little small town outside of Milan, and which is incidentally the town where my best friend lives, in Pavia, which is a nice little town and very peaceful and quaint, and is about an hour from Milan. And there is a church there, which is quite pretty, and the central court. And if you ever get to Milan, make sure you try to get Pavia, because Pavia is very pretty. Okay, so the driver is trying to get from Rome to Pavia, for example. And the driver starts off in Rome and must try to get from Rome to Pavia, but to do this has to accomplish a whole series of smaller steps. And to do this, there are signs, and whether you know the road well or whether you don't know the road well, and this is your first time, the signs are still necessary. Okay, so there's a whole sequence of steps and signs, and this driver has to accomplish every one of these steps in this series before being able to complete the goal-seeking behavior directed towards the town, or arriving at that town. Okay, but what Morris told us was that there is a blocked road, and hence the driver has to turn onto a side road. So before deciding to deviate, before deviating, before getting away, and thus enacting a semiotic chain, the driver reacts to certain information as if it's actually an obstacle, as if the driver is encountering an obstacle, a roadside obstacle. So the driver has to have first accomplished certain semioses, and this is to interpret the vocal sounds of the person speaking to the driver, the informer or something, or these days we have our our devices, and everything comes through our device. And the driver interprets this language or these information as language that the driver recognizes, and I'm refraining from using male or female pronouns here. Okay, so recognizes the language as language that the driver understands or recognizes through phonemes and everything else, and tag names and everything else. Secondly, the driver formulates the conclusion that the informer is informing the driver that the road is blocked. So prior to stopping to listen to the informer, what does the driver do? The driver has to accomplish all these interpretations. So, and the driver says, well, first of all, this is a person. Then the person is gesturing me to stop, and that there are stop signs directed to the driver, and the driver has to recognize the stop signs, and so forth. Okay, so there's a whole series of mini semioses that constitute the largest semiosis. And this is what Morris is telling us, that there is a sequence, and the signification is not about just one step. It's a whole series of semioses that all work together. So as I promised earlier on, we will now discuss the divisions by Morris. And Morris's divisions are very important because in dividing and increasing the complexity of the science of the sign, we are able to better understand the meaning or the definition of signification and what signification is. And remember that Morris avoided defining signification, but suggested that if we know the environments within each of which we have a certain signification, then we can better conceptualize the process of signification. And I've divided this into 6. And of course, the first one is the very obvious one and the famous one of syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And so this was not really pioneered by Morris. Of course, it was something that had existed a long time before, and its historical origins are in the art dicendi, or the artes dicendi, okay, in the medieval ages, which was grammar, the dialectic, and the rhetoric, and this was the trivium of medieval European schools, and it was quite the thing to study if you were studying in European school in the medieval ages, okay, back in the dark ages, so to speak. And this inspired Persian work, and we've very quickly touched on the idea of religion in the trinity of things, and Russian formalism, which we'll speak about later on, much later on, Russian formalism, which a lot of which was based on the Trinity, and the Persian idea of the Trinity, which was also incorporated into much of his work. So Peirce then built on this medieval trivium, the Trinity, or the trilogy, the trivium, and he interpreted the artes dicendi branches of semiotics and incorporated that into his work, and that was then speculative grammar, critical logic, which corresponded to the dialectic, and the methodeutic, which corresponded to rhetoric. And, this emerged in his work on firstness, secondness, and thirdness. So then, looking at this diagram, we see that in Peircean work, we have semiotics was divided into three disciplines: the speculative grammar, critique, and the methodeutic. Speculative grammar was the classification of function and form of all signs. The critique was the study of classification and validity of arguments, that is, the logic of abduction, induction, and deduction, and the methodeutic was the study of methods for attaining truth. So Morris took this and he divided it into three and sort of transformed it somewhat, and renamed the three categories and presented the syntactic or syntax, the semantic, semantics, and pragmatics. Now, syntax was about sign combinations. It is about sign combinations, the combination of signs, and how signs are combined and recombined in various ways. So what did Morris do then? Morris took these divisions and classifications and reclassified them or renamed them into a more modern form, I guess, and what is modern? We will also speak about modern in due course. And these are his very famous syntactic classification, his semantic classification, and his pragmatic. And the syntactic is the combination of signs which correlates with logical positivism. The semantic, which is the sign significations, which correlates with empiricism, and the pragmatic, which is the effect of signs on the interpreter, the interpretant, and so forth. The syntactic, said Morris, is the way that the sign relates to other sign vehicles, and the way that each sign relates to a sign vehicle. The pragmatic is the way that the sign system is used to understand the relation of the sign to the system, the outside system, the interpreter or the interpretant, and the effects of the sign and the sign system on the outside. And then finally, the semantic, which is the sign vehicle that relates to the designatum and the denotatum. And within the semantic, of course, the sign also has relation to the interpreter and the interpretant, and hence the semantic is a universal signification process, both within and without of the signification process. But then again, what is the signification process? It's, the process is made up of an infinite series or sequence of smaller processes that then become a sigma function, a summation of all these processes to develop a larger signification process. So what did Morris then say about these three divisions? He told us that semiotics as a science makes use of special signs to state facts about signs. It is a language to talk about signs, said Morris. Morris was very clear, very adamant about the fact that all three dimensions must be and are always involved. There is never a signification. Within which only one or two of these becomes involved. At every point, at every time, in every situation, all three become involved. And he told us that all three dimensions are involved and are objects of semiotics when signification occurs. And there is no exception to this. He told us that to restrict meaning to the semantic or the syntactic or the pragmatic dimensions of semiosis, instead of all, reduces the sign totality to one part only and nothing else. So it was a very holistic situation, holistic acceptance of these three. The second division is a division into three categories, and Morris separates these categories into the indexical sign, the characterizing sign, and the universal sign. And here he tells us that the indexical sign is a denotation of something that is actually existing, an object that actually exists. The characterizing sign denotes a plurality of actually existing objects, and the universal sign denotes all actually existing objects. The third division is a division of two, and these are the iconic and non-iconic signs, where the iconic signs demonstrate the properties of the denotator, and the non-iconic signs do not demonstrate the properties of denotator. Our fourth division is again broken up into two, and this is the division of Morris that I really like, I enjoy, because this is a PowerPoint in his work over the years, and it's indicative of how signs actually have pragmatic, let's say, pragmatic or semiotic illocution or perlocution, let's say, perlocution, which is a word that we will speak about later, and illocutionary force and perlocutionary force and Austin and Searle and everything, which is much later on. This was the division into signals and symbols. And he told us that signs, all signs are either signals or symbols, and this depends on whether or not they signify other signs or not, and how they signify other signs. So he told us that the signals do not interpret or are not interpreted to signify other signs. And hence the signals do not substitute themselves or are not substitutes for synonymous signs. The symbols, however, and the two words sound quite similar, so we have to be quite careful about how we use our phonetics. The symbols, however, are interpreted to signify other signs, and they also become substitutes for synonymous signs. And the operative word there is synonymous, because a symbol symbolizes something else, and you see the symbol, you say, that looks like this, when it must mean this, you know. So, for example, a map is a symbol of Australia, or of Germany, or of Bolivia or something, you know, because it looks the same. Okay, so the division 5 then, division 5 of Morris's, was the way in which he divided signification. And he spoke about land signs and com signs and stuff, and he told us that land signs are language signs, and that land signs must have com signs, which are significator, which are the same for producers and interpreters. Com signs may vary in the similarity of significator for interpreters and producers, and then he went on to speak about com symbols, where com signs substitute for other com signs. Com signals, however, and of course this is building on from the ideas of symbols and signals, com signals, however, are items where com signs do not substitute for other com signs. And the last division is his types of discourse, and this is quite extensive, so we're going to very briefly touch on this, and then later on come back to this, because it is a very important part of work on discourse and the semiotics of discourse, and we do not need to do anything more now than to quickly introduce this. Okay, so his divisions in discourse are such that there is a systematic use of signs that intends to systematize, and I emphasize the word systematize, behavior evoked by signs and other signs. So he classified discourse types according to a primary signifying mode, which we will talk about soon, and the use of signs. So the discourse types differentiated and classified through behaviorist concepts are such that a discourse type is a specialization of language for the better accomplishment of some specific purpose. So you have your different discourse types, and you have science and religion and so forth, and and it becomes the use of a language, but a specialization in its syntax, in its pragmatics, in its semantics. So Morris classifies the various types of discourse into a system, and on the basis of combining 4 of his sign modes with 4 primary sign uses. So if we combine 4 by 4, of course, we have 16, right? So each primary signifying mode correlates with sign use culminating in these 16 discourse types. And we're going to now look at the table and have a look at how he organized these. And we see that at the left column, we have mode, and then the top row we have use. So on the left we have the different modes, the designative, the evaluative, the prescriptive, and the formative, where the designative is predominantly descriptive. Within the evaluative, the evaluators act. Within the prescriptors act, and then we have the formative with the formators. Along the top column, we have our use column, and here we have the informative, the evaluative, the evocative, and the systemic. So for example, and I may as well go through all 16 because there aren't too many, but they're all quite interesting at any rate. The combination of designative and informative, we have scientific language. Designative and evaluative, we have storytelling. Designative and evocative, we have juridical. Designative and systemic, we have cosmological. Evaluative and informative, we have mystical. Evaluative and evaluative, poetic. Evaluative and evocative, moral. And evaluative and systemic, we have critical. Prescriptive and informative gives us the technological discourse. Prescriptive and evaluative gives us a political discourse. Prescriptive and evocative gives us a religious discourse. Prescriptive and systemic gives us a propagandistic discourse. And the last row, the formative and informative, we have a logical mathematical discourse. Formative and evaluative, we have a rhetorical discourse. Formative and evocative, we have a grammatical discourse. And formative and systemic, we have the discourse of metaphysics. So now let us look at the final part of Morris's work, and we are going to now have a quick look at his modes and his work on modes prior to getting into the final part of the talk, which is the linguistic anthropological part of the talk. His modes were quite extensive and quite tricky, and Morris is one of those people whose work is very easy to understand. It's quite graspable, but there is a lot to his work, a lot. As opposed to Jacques Lacan, whose work was not so extensive, but it was very tricky, which was as opposed to Roland Barthes, whose work was, again, quite simple to get, but very extensive. So, there are some people who do a little work, but it's very tricky and very complex, whereas other people do a lot of work, but, very simple to get. And this is Charles Morris, who had done a lot of work, and we can get everything, but we definitely cannot get everything in one talk, and we cannot hope to get everything over years and years. There's just so much. But we can do our best to summarize. And so hence we are summarizing everything, and with the modes that we will discuss now, it's the same thing. We are summarizing. Okay, so he gave us 5 modes of signifying the sign. And what were these modes? They were the identificative, the designative, the appraisive, the prescriptive, and the formative. Now, these are just words now, and we will soon get to understand what these are and how they work. And I will just very quickly, introduce these and how they work. And so he gave us the type of sign that correspond to various modes and what they signify and everything. And the first mode that we discussed was, of course, the identifier. IDENTIFIORS. Now, we spelled this with an O and not an E, and there is a reason why, and we will speak about that in due course. But the first one is the identifier, and this signifies the locator. And this locator corresponds to locations of objects in space or time. The second mode, the designator, signifies the discriminator. And this discriminator corresponds to the characteristics or the stimulus of properties or of objects. The third mode is the appraisers, and this signifies valuator, which become or correspond to preferred objects or situations, and they locate these preferred objects or situations. The fourth mode, the prescriptors, which signify obligator, and these are responses that are required of the interpreter. And the last mode, the formators, which signify formator, and these correspond to methods where signs combine, forming compound signs. All right, so these are the types of sign that correspond to certain modes that he presented. Ascriptors. What is an ascriptor? Well, first of all, before we speak about the ascriptor, we will speak about the identifier. Identifier, I-D-E-N-T-I-F-I-O-R. Not E-R, but O-R. An identifier, Morris tells us, is a sign that facilitates the identification of a denoted object. It's a sign that facilitates the identification of a denoted object. It's not the sign in question, but it facilitates the identification of a denoted object. It signifies the location of something, but does not signify anything else about this something. Just signifies the location, tells us where it is. It determines where and when the behavior directed towards something is, but it doesn't tell us about the type of behavior. And the type of behavior we must otherwise determine through other methods and employing other signs and so forth. It's not merely a device to draw attention to something, such as, by turning another person's head in a certain direction or something, but it has genuine sign status nonetheless. So it's a preparatory stimulus influencing the orientation of behavior with respect to the location of something else. So this is the identify or, and I emphasize the or because in work submitted to me, this is frequently, almost always misspelled. So what is an ascriptor then? Morris tells us that an ascriptor is a sign complex that identifies and signifies certain aspects of significator. And he breaks this down into four main categories, being the designative, the appraisive, the prescriptive, and the formative. So these are all according to the primary signifying mode, and there are four main divisions, of ascriptors. The first one, the designative ascriptors, is a complex of identifiers, now remember identifiers with the O, and designators. The second one, the appraisive, is a complex of identifiers and appraisers. The third one, the prescriptive, is a complex of the identifiers and prescriptors. And the last one, the formative, and as you'd expect, would be a complex of the identifiers and the formators. Okay, the final thing I want to say about modes, and this is, again, just a very brief touching on modes so we can get a landscape of who Morris is and what Morris has done, and then move on and build on this later on when time and resource allows, is the sign primary usage. And Morris tells us that there are four primary usages of signs. And these are the informative, which primarily contributes to designators. And designators have this function primarily. The second one is the valuative, and here appraisers primarily use this function. The incisive, which primarily contributes to prescriptors, and the systemic or the organizational. And formators primarily employ this as their function.